it's Ilana and welcome back to my channel. So for this video, I wanted to talk about some things that I wish I knew before working at a startup in San Francisco. I've worked at 3 startups now while living in San Francisco, so I wanted to share my experiences and what I've learned and basically kind of give this as an expectations versus reality type video. That's kind of the format that I want to go with this video. But if you're new to my channel, hi, welcome. I post content about what it's like to navigate life and dating in San Francisco. So if you are living in the Bay Area, or thinking about moving to the Bay Area, or you're single in general, who knows what the case is, subscribe down below because I think you'll really like it here. All right, let's go ahead and get into this video. Let's talk about one of the biggest things I learned the hard way when it comes to startups. Silly me, who was working her first job at an ABA agency, really jealous of people who worked at big tech companies and startups in the tech industry. If you worked at a startup, you would be making a lot of money and you would be making equity and you would just be filthy rich. Oh man, I clearly did not know anything about startups like I thought I did from an outsider's perspective. So for one thing, out of all the 3 startups that I've worked at, I've never received equity. Let me tell you that, because that's one reason as to why people want to join startups is because they have an entrepreneurial mindset and they can get a small share of the company and let that build up over time, and they invest it and then they cash it out and they have lots of money when they do that. That's like one of the big benefits of joining a startup. 2 out of the 3 startups that I've worked at have not offered equity. The startup that I currently work at does offer equity, but I sadly don't get any because, well, you know, I'm a contract worker, so that sucks for me. As far as terms of startup salaries go, where you saw how I was just laughing because I thought working at a startup meant good salary. Definitely not. In fact, startups tend to pay a lot lower than big mainstream tech companies. Startups can kind of go below the market rate because of the funding that startups receive, and they have very tight budgets on how much they can pay their employees. My first startup, I was not making a lot of money, but I was making more money than my ABA job, and I did have a stable salary with benefits. So that was the first time where I felt a little bit more financially consistent because I had a set salary, I didn't lose hours, I didn't lose pay. My vacations were paid for, so it was really nice to have that along with getting health insurance. But at the same time, I still wasn't getting paid a livable wage for San Francisco. And then the second startup that I joined, which is the one that laid me off after 3 weeks, well, that actually paid me very well. It didn't have equity, but it had good benefits. My healthcare premium was a lot lower because my company paid more than my first startup did. And I was just overall making a better salary, but I only got 1 good paycheck from that job, which is really unfortunate. And then the startup that I'm at now, I'm paid hourly, where it kind of feels like I'm working at my first non-startup job again, which sucks. It's been really difficult to find a startup that's paying me well because I keep joining such early stage startups. And I will say early stage startups are going to pay a lot less. Series A will still pay pretty low, but it will definitely have better funding than a seed startup. So if you want to look at a startup, I would say start looking at Series C because the pay might be a little bit better and more aligned within the market rate. That was just something that I really learned the hard way, and I feel really silly for everyone thinking if you worked at a startup, you'd be rich AF. Okay, let's go to the next thing I learned. Expectations versus realities about startups. You have the fun perks, aka that means it's a super dope, awesome place to work. Not necessarily. Just because an office has fun perks like a ping pong table, free lunch, commuter benefits, free alcohol, it's a pet-friendly office, doesn't mean it's a great place to live and that the company culture is amazing. That's certainly not the case. Just because you have nice things doesn't mean that your employees are going to stay because of that. Coming from an AV agency that didn't really have all these fun perks that other tech and startup offices had, I was always under the impression that if the office had these really cool fun things, that this would be a really fun, awesome place to work, and that going to work would be something that you would look forward to doing. But that's not the case. My first startup, I had free lunch, we had a ping pong table, we had free alcohol, dogs were allowed in the office, it was really awesome. The work culture, don't even get me started on that. Oh my gosh, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Ping pong table that we had, it was only allowed to be used during lunchtime or after work. You couldn't just take a quick break to play ping pong in the middle of the day. That wasn't allowed because you always had to be working. So it always felt like you weren't really allowed to use the ping pong table because of toxic work culture, which leads me into the next thing that we're gonna get into. Expectation of the startup, having an awesome work culture and being part of an awesome team. Startups mostly function over toxic hustle culture. Not all of them, but a good chunk of them. The first startup that I worked at, that I got fired from, thrived off hustle culture. You always had to be working, you always had to be productive. Things were incredibly fast-paced. There was so much burnout. It felt like there was no work-life balance. There are some startups that will make you go in at 8 in the morning and then you'll be leaving around 7 at 8 at night. You will literally be working 12 hours a day. You will burn out because you need to work hard to keep the business running, which I understand that startups do require a lot more time, but I think to constantly be working, to never have work-life balance, I find that to be very toxic and detrimental to someone's mental health. Upper management and C-level staff will push their workers beyond extremes and make them feel like they are slaves to the company. That's how I felt when I was working at my first startup. I felt like an absolute slave. And there was pressure to take calls on the weekends, but I never did it because I needed that work-life balance. That is something that you should keep in mind if you ever consider joining an early stage startup in San Francisco or even in any city in general, because Bay Area work culture, at least from my perspective of working in the Bay Area, there is so much toxic work culture, and it's definitely found in tech startups 100%. So just keep in mind, if you want to work at a startup, you could be working over 50 hours a week and going into the weekends. So buckle up because you could be going for a really ugly ride. My second startup, I would be done working by 5:30, and that was great. Another thing that I wanted to note about my first startup and how toxic it was is that we weren't allowed to leave until after 6 p.m. We were literally treated like children at my first startup. Now, they did change the culture over time, but that's because they saw that many people were leaving the company. There was a big mass exodus from my company. So my company woke up and realized, okay, we can't treat our employees like this anymore. But they kept having this mindset that, oh, we're a Bay Area startup, but we need to be working late at night. I remember I once got applauded for answering emails at 11 at night. And that says a lot about a company where they're making you check your email at 11 p.m. I gotta go to bed. I should be in bed by then. My bedtime is usually between 9:30 and 10 because I'm a grandma. So if you expect me to check emails at 11 p.m., I'm gonna go to another company. Bye. So you get it. Toxic work culture and hustle culture, it is so big in the Bay Area. And it's big in startups no matter what city you're located. But coming from my perspective, it's super real. Expectations versus realities. Thinking that I was going to have financial security if I worked at a startup because I was being paid a salary. Ha 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 ha. I was very bitter about my first job. I wanted a salary job, I wanted consistency, financial stability. So I thought that working at a startup would give me that. Not true. In fact, 90% of startups fail because they'll lose their funding or the product isn't that great, it doesn't do well, there's really not a big need for it. There are many reasons as to why startups fail, but 90% is a big percentage. You could lose your job at any given time, and I think the global pandemic has been a very good example of that. So many startups in the Bay Area have shut down or have had massive layoffs because their products have been completely useless due to the pandemic. So never feel safe working at a startup because it is a risk that you take when you sign that offer letter. No matter how good the benefits or the equity is, if you're lucky enough to get equity, you could lose your job at any given moment. Especially if the funding for that startup collapses, you're screwed and you're out of a job. So just know that you're taking a big risk when you work at a startup. My sister experienced a layoff at her first startup, yet her first job at a school. She was at the company for almost 3 years and then got laid off because of funding problems. So never feel safe at your job. An expectation that I had when it came to working at a startup is that the hiring process for a startup is just like any other company. Oh, I could not have been any more wrong. Startups are picky as hell. Startups want the best and the top of the top people. They want experienced people, not inexperienced people. If you're an entry-level candidate trying to get into a startup, you're probably not going to get hired unless they have an associate or junior level role. Or if they have an internship, which is really rare for startups because they don't even have the funds to do that or the time to train people for an internship. If you're expecting to gain experience as your first job at a startup, think again, go to a different company. You're better off finding a job at a big name company like Facebook or Google if you're an entry-level candidate, but for a startup, not so much. Startups are very judgy, and also they will judge you based off what kind of company you're coming from, what kind of industry you're coming from, maybe even what school you're coming from. Hiring managers, CTOs, and CEOs at startups are pretentious as hell. It's not fair. I'm totally with you if you're complaining about this, because I, as a recruiter who is looking for a new job, I am getting passed up by picky startups because they don't like the background that I'm coming from. It is a sad reality that we live in, especially for here in the Bay Area. This expectations versus reality. This one is gonna make me sound so silly. I remember when I was looking to leave my old company and I was excited about maybe exploring startups and recruiting. I thought, this is gonna be just like any other 9-to-5 job because it was an office job, right? Wrong. Startups are very fast-paced and things change all the time. And I just want to say that if you do not take change very well, you like things the way that they are, and the second something changes in your routine, startups are not for you. I would not proceed any further. But if you can adapt well to change and you don't mind change and you think it gives you a great challenge in your work life, then you may love a startup. That could be right for you. I take change very well. I don't mind change. The fact that I'm able to adapt to things changing all the time, that's never really been an issue or concern for me because I've always been a very flexible person. That's just who I am. But not everyone is flexible like me. So take that for what you will. A lot of startups do not have their shit together and things get very chaotic. You may find that at a startup that there will be a lot of bad management and management just simply doesn't have their shit together and they will constantly make mistakes and really piss off their employees because there's such poor structure. That was very common when I first started off at my first startup. The second startup that I worked at was very small, but I felt like things were well organized there. And then the place that I work now hasn't been that kind of experience, and I've felt very valued for once, which is why I like where I'm currently working. But I will say things are constantly changing at my company. For an example, this past week we were supposed to hire 2 interns or start a new intern role. And then the hiring managers of those intern roles said, never mind, we found somebody. Before I even launched the job, they found internal candidates. So you just never know what's gonna happen. Things just constantly change. That's something that I didn't know until I got into a startup. As I mentioned earlier, I know people who are looking for their first jobs need the experience. I will say the expectation I had of first joining a startup was thinking, oh, this is gonna be a great way to get experience in a job, just a regular job. Not thinking about just getting experience at a startup, but just getting more experience in a new field. That's not exactly the purpose of joining a startup. The purpose of joining a startup isn't to just get experience. It's really about you putting your entrepreneurial skills to the test. It's about you going into a company about wanting to make an impact on others and having a huge passion for their mission. So if you're going to interview at a startup, you better know what the company does and what their mission's all about, and you better have some sort of interest in that. Because if you don't have any kind of passion for what the company does, or you don't even know what the company does to begin with, you're not going to get hired there. And people who work at that startup will not take you seriously as a candidate. If you want to work at a startup, you have to be an individual who loves to make an impact on others and really believes in a product or the mission. That is huge for startups. That was something that I didn't completely learn the hard way. I mean, I've always been a firm believer, don't work at a company where you don't believe in the product or you don't care about what they do. That's been my philosophy this whole entire time, and this really applies to a startup especially. I mean, I kind of knew that this happened with a lot of companies, but I didn't know how much of a big deal it was for startups specifically. So if you are thinking about applying for a job at a startup, that's something that you can really take into consideration. So make sure you study up on the company and make sure you actually like what they do, because if you're not actually passionate about that kind of industry and what they do, you're not going to be happy there. Does that make sense? And then the last thing that I wish I knew with my expectations versus reality, I thought that working at a startup, I would be able to work freely, independently, and that management could trust me.
No.
There is so much micromanagement that goes on at startups. I'm not saying this happens for every startup, but so far in my experience, it's been a lot of micromanagement, and I hate being told what to do. Which is why I don't really like working a 9-to-5 job, but this is the situation I'm in right now. I am not able to be self-employed at the moment, even though I really would like to be. I experienced a ton of micromanagement and control at my first startup. My boss was always on top of my shoulder, wondering what was on my computer screen. Oh my god, I remember there was this one time where I would sit on the company sofa for about an hour doing work, because sometimes I just need to get away from my desk. And the CTO yelled at me saying, I don't want you sitting on the sofa anymore because I can't tell if you're working or not. Wow, way to trust me. I was incredibly insulted to not be trusted just because I'm not sitting at my desk. I can still get my work done by sitting on a sofa. I don't have to sit at a desk to get all my work done. This is why I got let go from this job, because there were so many bullshit culture misfits within that company. That also goes back to toxic work culture. Micromanagement is never a good thing. I don't think anybody likes to be micromanaged, but it happens a lot. And when your boss is constantly checking up on you, asking you what kind of work you've done today, where it feels like every single hour, that's not an ideal environment. And I certainly do not want to work for another company that does that to me. So I make it very clear when I interview, I don't like micromanagement. So when they ask me things like, what do you look for in a hiring manager? I say, I look for a hiring manager that trusts me and is willing to support me and does not micromanage. And I felt lied to when I was told, oh, we don't micromanage here because that's the way that they'll get you in. But the second you get micromanaged, you should get out, because nobody should have to put up with that shit. Those are all the expectations and realities that I wish I had known before I started working at a startup, and how I learned things the hard way. So I'm curious to know, are you currently working at a startup, or have you worked at a startup before? Comment down below and let me know what your experiences have been like. Have they been anything like mine, or did you have the same kinds of expectations like I did before I joined one? Comment down below, I'd love to know your thoughts. And if you liked this video and you thought you learned something, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!